Good day. My name is Bob Craven. I'm a PhD candidate in English at the University of Oregon. And today my talk takes a familiar American landscape and tries to defamiliarize it. Appalachia, stretching from New York to Alabama, is often associated with its beautiful mountains, its history of coal mining, its particular social problems. Most environmental treatments of the region emphasize things like toxic mine runoff, fracking, strip mining, black lung disease, and mountaintop removal. But I want to talk today about timber and argue that compared to these other issues that I've just listed, the logging of the Appalachian Blue Ridge and mixed mesophytic forests is an under-acknowledged loss. In the time since European colonists began to settle Appalachia in the 18th century, the region's hardwood forest has been reduced by about 95%. Especially during a compressed period between the 1880s and the Great Depression, the period I'll be focusing on today, the region, once thickly wooded, was denuded of its old-growth timber. In just 50 years of logging, a globally significant forest system was nearly entirely degraded or converted to agriculture. And yet this loss is rarely acknowledged or appreciated for what it is, a world historic event. In the broad scale, the cutting of the greater Appalachian forest was a seminal event in North American environmental history. So great was this loss in terms of biodiversity and cultural loss, that I view this event as a historical precedent to this century's ongoing destruction of the Amazon rainforest. Now, resource extraction is becoming a more and more important topic of discussion in the environmental humanities, and yet forest extraction is a relatively minor figure in this field. With energy humanities tending toward discussion of fossil fuels, the problem of deforestation remains obscure in comparison, especially in light of its importance on the North and South American scenes. But logging is extraction. Like uranium mining, oil drilling, timber cutting reorders the physical world, changing biological systems and sometimes exhausting limited resources. And like these other forms of extraction, industrial tree cutting modifies our daily life. I think few in the United States realize the unique qualities of the Appalachian hardwood forests or have internalized just how profound its loss is. So what was this forest like? For one thing, in addition to being a cultural landscape, of course, for Shawnee, Cherokee, Mingo, Muskogee, Catawba, and Chickasaw Americans, a place of incredible biodiversity. Scientists have identified 2 locations on Earth that compete for the highest number of tree species, and these 2 locations are Appalachia and eastern China. The only 2 places where a very unique forest profile can be found, with a hardwood canopy, a very diverse hardwood canopy, a magnolia field, and a richly flowering understory with ferns. It's found only in these places. The Appalachian forests often hosted more than 30 canopy trees species at a single site, with rich understories of ferns, fungi, perennial and annual herbaceous plants, shrubs, small trees, and diverse animal communities including songbirds, salamanders, land snails, and beetles. And some of the richest and most endemic biotas in the US and Canada, and the richest temperate freshwater ecosystems in the world, with globally high richness in mussels, fish, crayfish, and invertebrates. With its numerous stands of giant poplar, eastern hemlock, yellow buckeye, red maple, yellow birch, white oak, American beech, and sugar maple trees, the greater Appalachian forest was increasingly appealing to timber speculators in the 19th century as the vast resources of New England and the Great Lakes timberlands began to dry up. Because this is a short talk, I will not be getting into the history of Appalachian logging, nor its very serious environmental consequences, such as erosion, rampant wildfire, soil and water contamination, and the collapse of the region's agricultural system during the Great Depression. Instead, I'm going to use this chance to comment on how the deforestation of that region around the turn of the 20th century shaped American modernity and continues to affect us today. The contemporary scholar Vin Nardizzi has written compellingly about the cultural importance of wood to early modern Elizabethan civilization. Yet deforestation remains less examined regarding American modernization and the technological revolution that occurred around the turn of the 20th century. Above all, the Greater Appalachian Forest illustrates how North American modernity was achieved not only through mining and drilling, but of course through logging. From the onset of the modern period, of course, the naming, identifying, and cultivating of profitable plants, such as spices and medicines and garden rarities, was central to global commerce. And if you've read William Bartram's travels through Appalachia or Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, then you know how these colonial thinkers promoted the region's trees as colonial trade goods. But that was the 18th century, right? It might be easy to imagine that in the industrial era, humans have moved away from wood use. But indeed the opposite is true. Industrial machines actually created an increase in demand for wood and charcoal, which required mass quantities of tree felling. Throughout the 19th century, American freight trains ran on wood steam, and an average blast furnace in America accounted for the destruction of about 250 acres of woodland every year. And the Hopewell furnace in Pennsylvania was using up as much as 750 acres of woodland a year. That's according to Clive Ponting. More recent touchstones of modernity and modernism, mobility, science, urbanization, the depopulating of the countryside, all of these things too can be linked to logging. Take mobility, the rootlessness of a life on the road, a quality sometimes valorized in modernist studies. Modern mobility came about in part due to environmental and economic conditions that forced people to move where work and food were available. This process was very much sped along by the collapse of commonly used forest economies, where nuts, seeds, meat, and fuel could be sustainably harvested and often bartered for. More generally, the historically sudden disappearance of wooded places cannot be discounted as a foundation for the modernist affect. Think of a time that you have returned to a beloved wooded place to find missing trees. The ruthless timbering of North America, while providing structural materials for modern civilization, also provoked those feelings of social and environmental alienation that have for so long been identified as characteristic of the modern. After all, industrial logging had brought forth an era of ecological waste and decline that created literal wastelands across the eastern United States well before T.S. Eliot published The Wasteland in 1922. So modernity was built not only with coal, oil, and steel, but with wood too. Whole forests were converted into planks, beams, warships, theaters, charcoal, and pulp. Their biomatter went into the creation and maintenance of farms, coal mines, hospitals, dams, tunnels, libraries, bridges, arsenals, laboratories, and roads literally around the world. The greater Appalachian forest is so diminished today because its hard and soft woods became this fuel and this construction material, the construction of modern culture itself. And it's worth noting that Louisa, Kentucky was, for 30 years near the end of the 19th century, the world's leading exporter of hardwoods. So we can fairly say that as ancient hardwoods crashed down, modernity was fashioned. The converting of trees into roller coasters, something that I haven't mentioned yet, gives us, I think, a unique viewpoint into this process of modernization through logging. I want to close with the wooden roller coaster as a herald of the modern age in the northern Appalachian region. Roller coasters testify to the continuing centrality of wood, not only to the modernizing project, but even to those exhilarating qualities of modern life. Especially where trees were plentiful, wood was an abundant structural material that permitted these extravagant and experimental works of engineering. Here's a map that I'm putting together showing the peak of heavy logging, 1880s to 1920s, showing locations of these roller coasters in the region. As you can see, although Coney Island in Brooklyn, New York was the most popular, some of the earliest American amusement parks were in fact built in or beside Appalachia, especially the northern part of the region. Luna Park in Pittsburgh operated from 1905 to 1909 as the first amusement park to be fully lit with electricity. West Virginia had its own amusement parks in Wheeling in 1905 and in Charleston in 1912, while Rocky Glen Park in Moosic, Pennsylvania by the 20s had a miniature railroad and a hybrid wood and steel roller coaster called the Jazz Railway. If I had more time, I would go on listing these, but we might not associate Appalachia with cutting-edge amusements, right? But the region truly innovated in this regard. Right at the height of logging, as you can see here, Pennsylvania especially, etymologically, Penn's Woods, became basically this fertile crescent for wooden roller coasters. The new forms of extraction that became possible during the timber boom, new means of transit, a bountiful supply of timber, created both ruined forests and these bizarre new thrills. The early appearance of amusement parks in Appalachia cuts against the popular image of the region as an untechnologized backcountry. Central and northern Appalachia, in the period of intensive timbering, had as many parks as the Northeast. Wood, of course, was the most visible building material on these machines. And while wood roller coasters needed steel and motors to power their chain lifts, it was the availability of massive quantities of wood, moved by water, animals, and rail, that enabled this incredible burst of cultural exuberance. The forest cover declined. Ancient groves in West Virginia and western Pennsylvania were cut away and sold. And then amid this abundance of newly extracted energy and material, these pleasure parks began to appear. The period's main economic technologies, like the trolley, the sawmill, the train, and the log flume, transformed the landscape, yes, but they also transformed culture, enabling these new mechanical forms of recreation. I'm really interested in learning more about this leap that the technologies take from industrial work sites to pleasure destinations. The more I have explored the history of forest extraction in central and northern Appalachia, the more I suspect that these developments in fun and recreation came out of worksite play, amusements of working class families in industrial workplaces. I'm proposing that the extractive industries of the 19th and 20th centuries, with their connections to nature and to dangerous labor, likely carried a very strong romance in the popular imagination. And to illustrate this link for you with an example, did you know that the first roller coaster in the world was in fact built to carry coal? This is the Mach Chunk and Summit Railroad, the United States' second permanent railroad, opened in Pennsylvania in the 1820s. For over 100 years until the Depression, this switchback railway was used to carry coal by gravity over 9 miles of track and down 1,000 feet in elevation to be carried back up by work animals. It is documented that as early as 1827, miners and tourists would, at great personal risk, ride this thing to the bottom. Such exuberance at the coal mines really excites me as a reader of historical landscapes. But of course, 200 years later, we're still doing this ritual on a massive scale in the global roller coaster industry. And when we connect the roller coaster to these coal trains, then other amusements like the mill chute and the old mill dark rides, they start to look different too. Here you can see a log flume from Oregon in 1896. These were used by sawmills to cheaply move timber downhill, usually over very rugged terrain that would be hard to move the logs over. And to inspect these flumes, and likely to just have some fun, flume shepherds would occasionally ride down the whole thing on top of a log. In the 1960s, amusement parks everywhere built rides based on this mythology. You may have ridden one like this. So extractive culture is found not only at sites of extraction, but also at these sites of energy consumption. Extractive workers like loggers, miners, and tunnelers, as well as the extracted materials, ores, timbers, and fossil fuels, are fundamental not only to powering the global economy, enabling our social lives as we know them, but also inspired these modernist, high-speed amusements. But as humans fashion their modern lives out of wood, it should give us pause to consider that contemporary ecologists view land biomes as systems in which vegetation, and not animal life, is of primary importance, due to the complete dependence, direct or indirect, of animals upon plants. We urgently need to implement policy strategies based around conservation of large, interconnected expanses of mature forests before they're all gone. Even if we say that the age of wood is over, it does not change the fact that 1.6 billion people worldwide depend on forests for their daily livelihoods, or that 300 million people live inside forests today, or that 80% of global biodiversity is found in forest habitats. Forests continue to provide vital biophysical functions like absorbing CO2 and light. And if the age of wood were over, furthermore, would deforestation be such a pressing global concern? Over 15 billion trees are cut down each year, equal to 18.7 million acres of forest lost annually, according to a large recent study. Forests don't grow fast enough to replace this rate of loss. The Amazon, the Earth's largest rainforest, lost at least 17% of its forest cover in the last half-century due to human activity alone. The island of Sumatra has lost 85% of its forests, mostly for palm oil and palm pulp plantations, and a similar level of destruction is taking place in Borneo. In Appalachia, pictured here, over 500 forested mountains have been destroyed and flattened since the 1970s to reveal subsurface coal seams. Therefore, wood is a resource to continue studying and thinking about because it is very much still with us. Thank you very much for clicking on my video, and thank you to the ASLE organizers for putting together this virtual event.